Thanks to Wondrium for sponsoring this video. The traditional site of the execution, burial, and resurrection of Jesus are all housed within one building, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Well, at least according to most Christians, including the Catholic Church, the Armenian Apostolic Church, and the Greek, Coptic, Syriac, and Ethiopian Orthodox churches, all of whom share some degree of ownership of the site. Many Protestant Christians aren't so sure about the authenticity of the Holy Sepulchre, but we'll get to that later. Located in the northwest corner of the Old City of Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was originally commissioned by the Roman Emperor Constantine and dedicated in 335 CE. However, much of the building you see today is a medieval construction. Over the course of its history, it was damaged again and again, either from fire, earthquake, or invading armies. If you want to see evidence of the original church, you can see some remnants in the adjacent building called the Alexander Hospice, and the area around the rotunda, which preserves most of its remains still standing. But even so, the dome has been rebuilt repeatedly, and none of the original interior decoration from that era survives. Today, its bluish-gray domes stand out on the skyline of the old city. Inside the church, you can wind through the dark, cavernous halls, visit the purported site of the crucifixion, watch pilgrims touch the so-called Stone of the Unction, where the body of Jesus is said to have been anointed for burial, and of course visit the traditional site of the tomb itself, which stands in the main rotunda of the church inside a shrine called the Edicule. The majority of Christians throughout history have accepted the authenticity of this location, and thousands of pilgrims visit the church each day. But what does archaeology tell us about the building and its surrounding area? Is this a plausibly authentic site for the tomb of Jesus? And are there any alternative locations in Jerusalem that can lay claim to it? Before we examine the site itself, we need to understand a few things about the nature of our sources, the New Testament Gospels, our primary literary accounts of the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. These texts are not uncomplicated eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. Scholars have long debated what historical kernels we can glean from these texts, and what parts are embellishments or later fabrications. However, out of everything described in the Gospels, the crucifixion is probably the event most widely accepted by scholars to be historical, though there's still some debate over what likely happened to his body after the fact. The Gospels say that a Jewish religious leader and follower of Jesus named Joseph of Arimathea obtained the body from the Romans and buried it in a brand new private family tomb. Scholars fall into a few camps on the plausibility of this story. Some argue that it's more likely that the body of a crucified enemy of the state from a lower-class family would have been dumped in a pit grave or trench grave, or left on the cross for the vultures. This is notably argued by the New Testament scholars Bart Ehrman and John Dominic Crossan, who cite cases of Roman authorities denying proper burial to criminals by simply leaving the body on the cross. Other critical scholars argue that the broad outlines described in the Gospels are either the more likely outcome, or at the very least a plausible outcome for the body of Jesus, based on what we know about Jewish burial practices of the time. Jewish law in Deuteronomy 21 says to bury executed criminals by sundown, and there's evidence that Jews in the first century followed this law. For example, the Jewish historian Josephus mentions that Jews of his time were so careful about funeral rites that even malefactors who have been sentenced to crucifixion are taken down and buried before sunset. And the Jewish philosopher Philo mentions a few cases when Roman authorities released the bodies of executed criminals to family members for proper burial. The respected archaeologist Jody Magnus summarizes her more careful position on the likelihood of burial when she says, "Although archaeology does not prove there was a follower of Jesus named Joseph of Arimathea, or that Pontius Pilate granted his request for Jesus' body, the gospel accounts describing Jesus' removal from the cross and burial accord well with archaeological evidence and with Jewish law." Though even this position is split between scholars who hold the traditional view described in the Gospels, that Jesus ended up in a proper family tomb, and others who argue he probably received a burial, but a dishonorable burial in a tomb reserved for criminals. This latter position interprets details from the Gospels as later embellishments, such as the idea that the tomb was brand new and donated by a virtuous man. But as Jody Magnus says, the tools of archaeology are very limited in answering specific details such as this anyway. So if we're going to try to answer the question, is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre the authentic site of his tomb, we first would need to grant the conclusion of one side of this debate, that Jesus was buried in a tomb in the first place, a position held by many scholars, perhaps even most scholars, but it's still a question debated within the field. If you'd like to learn more about how historians study the Gospels from an academic perspective, then you should really check out today's sponsor, Wondrium. Wondrium is an online learning platform featuring a ton of educational video content. And when it comes to content about early Christianity, I've always been impressed by their library. In this video, I've already cited the scholars Jody Magnus and Bart Ehrman, who both host series on Wondrium, including Dr. Magnus' series Jesus and His Jewish Influences, and Dr. Ehrman's series The Triumph of Christianity, which focuses on the first few centuries of Christianity's history. Wondrium's library is always evolving too. For example, they recently launched a new series called Searching for the Historical Jesus, which walks the audience through the major events of the life of Jesus as described in the Gospels. The series also features some absolutely stunning photography from the Galilee region and Jerusalem, which really brings the topic to life. If you'd like to watch this series or those by Dr. Magnus or Dr. Ehrman, Wondrium is offering the Religion for Breakfast audience a free trial. Head on over to wondrium.com/religionforbreakfast or click the link in the comments below. Let's return now to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and ask a more general question. Why is the church in this location and not somewhere else? The simplistic answer to why here is because that's where Emperor Constantine said to dig. Or more specifically, that's where the Bishop of Jerusalem said to dig after he got permission from Constantine. The early Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea is our primary source for the discovery of the alleged tomb of Jesus. In his biography of the Emperor Constantine, Eusebius describes the Bishop of Jerusalem, Macarius, asking Constantine for permission to start an excavation to search for the tomb, a request that Constantine was more than happy to grant. You may have heard that the Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, chose the spot instead. This is a claim repeated online all the time, including on Wikipedia, but it's probably not true. Our earliest source about the construction of the church is Eusebius, who only mentions Constantine and Macarius being involved. Now, Eusebius does mention Helena elsewhere in the text, but he only gives her credit for sponsoring two churches, one in Bethlehem, commemorating where Jesus was supposedly born, and one on the Mount of Olives, where Jesus is said to have ascended to heaven. Eusebius lavishes her with praise, so had she been involved with excavating the tomb of Christ, we would expect him to mention her as well, but her involvement is mentioned decades later by other Christian writers. For example, the Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, writing almost a century after Eusebius, explicitly says that Helena, the emperor's mother, being divinely directed by dreams, went to Jerusalem. She sought carefully the sepulchre of Christ, and after much difficulty, by God's help, she discovered it. But as far as we can tell, the church was already being built by the time Helena arrived in Jerusalem around 327 CE. After demolishing a temple to Aphrodite built over the area, the excavators soon made a discovery. Eusebius writes, "As soon as the original surface of the ground appeared, immediately and contrary to all expectation, the venerable and hallowed monument of our Savior's resurrection was discovered." Apparently, they had discovered a tomb under the temple, which they identified as the tomb of Jesus, though Eusebius is vague about why they immediately knew this. The scholar Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who was a strong proponent of the authenticity of the site, speculated that the tomb may have been covered in Christian graffiti, a practice attested elsewhere in the region. But skeptics might say that Macarius would have happily labeled any tomb he discovered the tomb of Christ. Though it's not immediately clear why Macarius started digging at this location in the first place without first digging into the archaeology. As early as the late 1st century, Christian tradition had already established that Jesus was crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem. The book of Hebrews straight up says that Jesus suffered outside the gate. Whoever wrote Hebrews possibly inferred this idea from the Gospels. The Gospels say that Jesus went out toward the place where he would be crucified, and then describe him meeting Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and was not yet inside the city walls. The text then says that Simon carried the cross the rest of the way to Golgotha, or the place of the skull. So this idea is already found in early Christian texts, and scholars generally agree that any crucifixion would have taken place outside of the walls of Jerusalem anyway, based on what we know about Roman execution practices. Moreover, most Roman-era burials were also outside the city walls. The tombs of that era, for those who could afford them, generally contained burial niches called loculi. The bodies would be placed in these loculi, and after the course of about a year, the bones were typically collected from the niches and placed in a bone box called an ossuary. So romantic depictions of a single-person tomb with a shelf for Jesus' body are completely inaccurate. Almost all of these tombs held multiple bodies. Archaeologists have explored hundreds of these tombs in the vicinity of Jerusalem, and the overwhelming majority of them are outside the walls of the city. In fact, according to Jody Magnus, Jerusalem was basically surrounded by a necropolis of rock-cut tombs during the lifetime of Jesus. So if it was common sense that any crucifixion and burial would have occurred outside of Jerusalem, and there's even a scriptural tradition to back that claim up, the current location of the church might seem to contradict this. The church is squarely within the big, impressive walls of the old city. But these walls are much more recent, constructed under the Ottomans during the 16th century. During the 1st century, this area was almost certainly outside of the walls of Jerusalem. We know this because of the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, who seems to have an accurate knowledge of Jerusalem's layout, as well as from the findings of archaeological excavations. Now, today the area around the Holy Sepulchre is not the most conducive place to conduct archaeology. It's a densely built-up area, and if you visit it, the church entrance seems to emerge suddenly after winding your way through narrow pathways. But some small excavations nearby have shown that the area was the site of a rocky ancient quarry. These excavations also suggest that the area was undeveloped during the time of Jesus, lacking any buildings that date to the 1st century. Moreover, the church appears to be built over several of those tombs that I mentioned before, the tombs that surround Jerusalem. 6 burial niches from the late Second Temple period are preserved in a small Syrian Orthodox chapel next to the rotunda. Visitors can enter the chamber and view the niches today, though I apologize for the super dark footage. This is the best I could get blindly sticking my camera inside, but you can see the niches here on screen. Because of their proximity, some scholars argue that these visible burial niches and the alleged tomb of Christ isolated inside the edicule may have originally been part of the same burial complex that was severed by Constantine's workmen when the original church was built. So based on the historical and archaeological evidence, the space around the Holy Sepulchre did indeed sit outside of the walls of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. What's interesting though is that this location was inside the walls during Constantine's excavation. In the early 2nd century, the Emperor Hadrian rebuilt and resettled Jerusalem, giving it a new Latin name, Aelia Capitolina. The Romans proceeded to radically transform the layout of the city. This included expanding the city to incorporate the area that would one day be the site of the church, and also constructing a new Temple of Aphrodite, the same temple that Eusebius says was demolished in the quest for the tomb of Jesus. This means that Constantine and the Bishop Macarius decided to dig at a location inside the city of their present day, contrary to the tradition that Jesus' tomb was located outside of the city. Some have argued that the decision to dig at this location, inside the walls, does not make any sense unless they were acting on a pre-existing local tradition. A tradition perhaps stretching back to the 2nd century or earlier that had long since identified this site under the Temple of Aphrodite as the location of the tomb of Jesus. According to this theory, the local Christian community couldn't act on the tradition and uncover the tomb until Constantine had legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. Pointing to a few threads of evidence, scholars like Joan Taylor argue that this location was known prior to Constantine. For example, writing in the middle of the 2nd century, the Christian bishop Melito of Sardis mentions that Jesus was killed in the middle of Jerusalem, in the middle of the street. Although Melito might just be using poetic language here, it could indicate that the author was aware of a local tradition that recognized a location within the 2nd century walls as the site of the crucifixion. Another possible clue was discovered in the basement of the church. A foundation wall was uncovered from the Temple of Aphrodite that Hadrian had built over the site. The excavation revealed a drawing of a ship, with a Latin inscription usually translated, "Lord, we have come." Some scholars see an echo of Psalm 122 in the language of this inscription, which describes a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Based on this understanding, some have argued that this inscription was scratched by some anonymous Christian pilgrim who had journeyed from the Western Latin-speaking half of the empire to venerate the tomb of Jesus. Scholars are divided on when to date the inscription. Some say it predates Constantine, perhaps even to the 2nd or 3rd century. If it does indeed date back to the 2nd century, this would lend credibility to the idea that a tradition located the tomb of Christ in the vicinity of Hadrian's temple. But many scholars that I've read on the subject date the inscription to the 4th century, so this evidence remains unclear. And that's basically all the evidence we're working with. So where does that leave us with the question, is this the authentic location of the tomb of Jesus? Ultimately, it's impossible to answer definitively. Based on the available evidence, the best we can say that it's a plausible location. The area was an undeveloped quarry outside the walls of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus, which coheres with what's described in the Gospels. The area had at least a few tombs, and Constantine's decision to dig there was seemingly not random, but rather was guided by a pre-existing local tradition. Because of these lines of evidence, Jody Magnus says, many scholars think that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre likely is the authentic spot where Jesus was crucified and buried, because the tradition is so ancient. But you still have that 300-year gap, which is a leap of faith that archaeology cannot cross. And it's that 300-year gap in evidence that leaves other scholars unconvinced. There is no shortage of pilgrimage sites around the Holy Land associated with famous events based on no evidence or flimsy evidence. The scholar James Tabor says the traditional site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre fits none of the evidence. In the early 4th century, there was no memory of the original tomb of Jesus, or the site of the crucifixion, as that oral tradition that would have belonged to the Jerusalem church had long ago perished. I have no doubt that Macarius acted upon a local oral tradition that guided him and Constantine to start digging in this specific location, but it's difficult to confirm how far back that tradition goes, especially whether or not that oral tradition originates from the first generation of Christians. Some scholars are particularly skeptical because of catastrophic events that would have disrupted the Christian community of Jerusalem from accurately passing on the location, if that location was indeed known. In 70 CE, the Romans sacked Jerusalem, famously destroying the Second Temple and causing many of its people to flee the city. Also in 135 CE, Hadrian is said to have resettled the city, mostly with military veterans from nearby areas. By the time of Constantine, Jerusalem, or Aelia Capitolina as it was known, was a drastically diminished city. In the words of Jan Willem Drivers, an insignificant provincial town with perhaps no more than 5,000 to 6,000 inhabitants. Jerusalem was therefore a transformed city, both in terms of its population and its physical cityscape, which may have disrupted any transmission of local oral tradition. Hadrian's Temple of Aphrodite looms large in this discussion. Eusebius records a tradition that Christians blamed the Romans for purposely obscuring the tomb of Christ with this temple. He writes, "Godless people had gone to great pains to cover up this divine memorial of immortality, so that it should be forgotten." But Drivers argues that Hadrian more likely chose the site because of its location. The site of the Aphrodite Temple was one of the most elevated places in Aelia, apart from the now destroyed Temple Mount. Moreover, its prominent entrance was situated at Aelia's colonnaded main road called the Cardo Maximus. So skeptics might say the tradition that Hadrian purposely went out of his way to obscure the tomb of Jesus dates to the 2nd century and tells us nothing about its real location. The rumor may have developed because the Temple of Aphrodite was a new major landmark and focal point in the rebuilt city, and thus was a prominent lightning rod drawing the ire of a Christian minority in a newly pagan city. So my read on the question of authenticity is this. Based on the available evidence, archaeology cannot disprove the location, and some aspects of the location do accord with what's described in the Gospels. But the authenticity of the site rests on the likelihood that oral tradition accurately preserved knowledge of the location through the centuries to the time of Constantine, a tradition that then guided their decision to dig within the contemporary walls of their city. So let's turn from a plausible location to a definitively implausible location. Against this famous site in the Old City, another contender for the tomb of Christ emerged, a location that became known as the Garden Tomb. Located outside the medieval walls, north of Damascus Gate, the story of this tomb begins in the 18th and 19th centuries, as Protestant Christians began to doubt the authenticity of the Holy Sepulchre. But the story really takes off with the American scholar Edward Robinson, who visited Ottoman-era Jerusalem in 1838. In his personal quest for physical evidence of the Bible, he vowed to ignore all ecclesiastical traditions, even those that were most sacred, such as the location of the tomb of Christ. In the publication of his travel accounts, he claims that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre could not be the location of the tomb, based on his assumption that it fell inside the walls of Jerusalem during the life of Jesus. Some accepted this idea, but it also drew fiery backlash, even from fellow Protestants. Nevertheless, Robinson's book was read across the world, and his ideas caught on. The groundwork for an alternative location for the tomb of Christ had been laid. Fast forward to 1883, when one of England's most famous generals traveled to Jerusalem, Charles Gordon, a renowned leader in the British Empire. Like other Europeans in the 19th century, he had long wanted to explore the Holy Land, and one of the major ideas he floated was a new location for the site of Golgotha. While sitting on the roof of his building, Gordon would often meditate while looking north toward a rock face with an interesting shape. According to him, it looked like a skull. If the term Golgotha referred to a physical hill that looked like a skull, Gordon believed he had found the location where Jesus had been crucified. Now, several others before him had already proposed this idea, but it quickly became attached to Gordon. He was later killed in battle, and the fame of this British war hero lent serious credibility to the idea, mainly among Western Protestants. The Skull Hill quickly became known as Gordon's Calvary. If the location of the crucifixion had been found, the search for the tomb was on. There are several tomb complexes nearby Gordon's Skull Hill, including the site now known as the Garden Tomb just a few meters away. This tomb was excavated in 1867 and was accepted as the Protestant location for the Tomb of Christ. The property was purchased in 1894, and the Garden Tomb Association was soon established. To this day, the site remains open to the public in East Jerusalem, and Protestant Easter services are even held in front of the tomb to this day. So is this a contender for the authentic tomb of Jesus? No, not at all. In 1986, the archaeologist Gabriel Barkay conducted a study of the Garden Tomb. He concluded, based on the shape of the tomb, that it had been carved out not during the time of Jesus, but in the Iron Age, hundreds of years earlier during the Kingdom of Judah. The tomb lacks the burial niches common to the Second Temple period, and instead contains the remnants of burial benches that were used in the Iron Age. Moreover, there are other Iron Age tomb complexes nearby the Garden Tomb, and by contrast, tombs from the Roman period are not known in the area. Barkay's study dealt a serious blow to the idea that the Garden Tomb could be the tomb of Christ, and no scholar to my knowledge views it as a plausible candidate. Moreover, it's unlikely this hill looked the same 2,000 years ago anyway. Erosion is a thing, especially for those of you that have experienced Jerusalem's winters. But comparing the two sites is interesting. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Garden Tomb are very different. One, a monumental building, built and rebuilt over the centuries. The other, a modern garden planted around a simple Iron Age tomb. But despite the differences between these two proposed locations for the tomb of Christ, they share an interesting parallel. Both tombs illustrate how Christian pilgrims transform the Holy Land, transforming the landscape into a network of significant places tied to significant moments mentioned in the Bible. Pilgrimage is also a transformative experience for individual Christians as well, both then and now. Pilgrimage provides an opportunity for Christians to experience their religion in a very physical, tangible way, which is on full display when you visit the church today, with Christians kissing the stone of the unction or looking in awe at the rotunda. By ordering the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Constantine not only left his mark on the skyline of Jerusalem, but also left his mark on Christian practice, creating a site that continues to draw millions of pilgrims each year.